Welcome to the PIWORLD webinar on Thursday, the 5th of November 2020. And I'm your host, Tamsin Freeman. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Paul Jourdan, CEO and co-founder of Amati Global Investors. Paul, many thanks for joining us.
Great pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for having me on the show.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into a career in investing? Because I think you started off as a concert violinist. So how you got into your career?
Well, I like to think that fund management was my third career. So you're right. My first career was as a violinist, which was a hugely exciting thing to do and a great privilege to have done. And while I was working as a violinist in the City of Birmingham Symphony Orchestra, investment became a hobby of mine. And it became a more serious hobby after I got to know a wonderful gentleman by the name of David Fuller, who wrote a monthly investment strategy newsletter and ran a much-loved website, latterly with an analyst he took on called Ewan Tracy, who still runs it. David's now very sadly died. But he was a brilliant strategist, and he really introduced me to the way that markets behave and told me gave me all sorts of ideas about how you can analyze markets, and it was my hobby. So, I think most musicians who end up traveling a lot have some time to fill. You need things to think about, and I just got interested in financial markets and through the lens of David Fuller's analysis, really. And it was about 6 years later when I'd left the orchestra, done a PhD in music history, part funded by trading Japanese yen futures and options and all sorts of crazy stuff. When I kind of learned my way around financial markets, I thought, when I was finishing the PhD, I thought, well, this is a brilliant time when you're leaving university for a second time to choose something different to do. And I knew exactly what I wanted to do, which is a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing because it made me very focused. It's a bad thing because I would have been very disappointed had I not found an opening. And I applied for all the fund management training jobs I could find advertised, and was really lucky to get a training job up in Edinburgh, where I really wanted to move to Edinburgh as well. And I came to work for a company called Stuart Ivory, who were running a graduate training program at the time. And 2 years later, I passed all my exams and took on this, what is now the Amati UK Smaller Companies Fund, but back then was the first state British Smaller Companies Fund, I think it was called.
And what's the performance of the funds been like since you've been running them?
Perhaps I can bring up the graph of the Amati UK Smaller Companies Fund. This graph goes back to August 2000, and the reason it goes back to there is that's when I started running it, back at First State, which had taken over Stuart Ivory, the company I trained in. And I was asked then, when First State bought Stuart Ivory, if I'd like to apply for the job of running this fund, and I jumped at the chance. It did have plenty of problems that came with it, but it was a brilliant opportunity for a newly qualified fund manager to take on a fund like this. And 20 years later, and I've just passed my 20th anniversary running it. This is where we are, and it's been a long and bumpy ride. But what's really striking about this is just how strong the last decade has been. And we can talk a bit more about this later. But I think there are some reasons that when you stand back, there are some pretty clear reasons why it should be that the last 10 years has been so strong. And of course, you should never extrapolate this going forward. We always have to assume the future is going to be different. But there are some interesting things behind why this is, and it's mainly to do with the kind of industrial revolution we've been living through, to do with digital technology. And if we have a look at the VST performance, and the reason this goes back 10 years is because Amati owned VST is the amalgamation of various VSTs. And this one we took over the management of just after we started Amati Global Investors in 2010. And at the time it was called Victory VST. And it just happens that we've merged all the other VSTs we've been running into this one. And so we now just run one VST, which is fantastic. It really makes our lives a lot simpler, and it gives the the company, the investment company, some economies of scale. And we took it over in March 2010, so we normally show the performance of this from when we took it on. And again, you can see it's been a strong 10-year period, and I'm going to be talking about similar reasons why this has been strong, but it's particularly the last 5 here where we've seen very good performance. And I think that's also reflecting something of the maturing of the AIM market. This is an AIM VST, and it invests almost only on the AIM market. And the AIM market has matured, I think, really strongly in the last 5, 6, 7 years. And to a degree, that's been missed by some long-standing market commentators who still like to think of it as a very dangerous junior market. It's now got some really very large companies on it and some pretty mature businesses. And because in the AIM VST, we tend to be very long-term investors in companies, particularly ones where we think we made a really good investment, we hang on. And those companies have now really matured into very good-sized, mature companies.
So how do you spot the winners at such an early stage? What quantitative and qualitative characteristics are you looking for in companies?
Well, we could spend the whole of the rest of the time talking about that question. We're investors are growth investors like us. We're typically looking for a particular combination of skills and business assets and business opportunity, business plan, and there is no kind of neat definition of what it is you look for. But it's a combination of all of those factors, and particularly in the VST, we have some criteria that I think push us in the direction of trying to make longer term investments. So when we're making a new investment in the VST, we're imagining ourselves a number of years down the road and thinking, well, has this company got the potential to become a sought after mainstream investment on the AIM market, and multi-100 million pounds market cap, a good growth profile, some predictability, some forecastability, a stable management structure, a shareholder base where we really like the management team of a company to be significant investors in the company, and we really like it where the founder is still running the business. And very often in the VC, that's what we're going to find, because we're investing when the founder's still very much around. But we're looking for the combination of skills and assets and business opportunity that are going to allow that kind of path to unfold.
And on a quantitative level, what are you looking at? Is return on invested capital or any matrix like that of importance to you?
Well, it's very often with the VCT, we have to invest at a stage where you have to extrapolate what the return on capital is going to be, because they haven't yet had the capital to make the return on them. I think it was Jeremy Grantham, a well-known sort of value investor commentator from the US, much followed and much read by the investment community, who once, I think it was him, who once gave a critique of the kind of ultra value investing type approach, where you only buy kind of discarded assets at below book value and all of that, as along the lines of, well, yes, but that's all very well, but you'll never create anything new with that kind of investing. And the VCT is all about creating new businesses. It's why we get this big tax relief from the government, and we're there. Our job is to find the next generation of successful companies and to support them. And the VC only buys new shares in companies; it doesn't buy shares on the market. And so we're very much about funding projects within companies which we think have got the right characteristics. So yes, the kind of quantitative work we'll do will be figuring out, well, what are the chances of success? If it's successful, what does success look like? And if it's successful, does that result in a big enough business to be attractive to a wide range of other investors? Does it create an important business, in other words?
And you've picked some amazing winners like Keywords, like Learning Technologies, like GB Group, like Frontier Developments. It's been a phenomenal success record. Have you had more that have not been successful? It's just a probabilities game, or would you say you've outperformed in terms of probabilities?
that's always quite a hard piece of work to do. I mean, I obviously like to think we have done. A fund manager can only ever be as good as the set of opportunities that a market presents. And the stock market is a defined universe of companies. And it so happened that 2013, 14, 15, we had this range of really rich opportunities to invest in, and those have very much carried the performance of the last 5 years, and they've made the VCT what it is today, where the top holdings are dominated by some pretty big mature businesses that came from those years, really, most of them, and they were very well formed companies. I could look back and say, well, they weren't that difficult to spot because they were just great businesses, and they ticked all of our boxes. I'd like to think we'd find them again, and we do find things when they come along. I mean, the listeners may not know that the VCT rules also changed a great deal between 2016 and 18 to really push the whole VCT industry to just support companies to grow. And I think AIM VCT managers have always done that, but in the world of private companies, you can create whatever kind of company you like, and it doesn't necessarily have to be funded for growth. It can be funded just to get the tax relief and hand the money back. And so that's kind of stopped in the VC industry. And, I think everyone in the industry now regards that as a very good thing, because it's brought this real focus and purpose to the VC industry. It's clarified it all. But one of the impacts for us is it has meant that there are certain categories of business that we used to be able to invest in, which we now can't. Which things like roll-up stories, where an entrepreneur might see an opportunity to roll up a number of small companies in an industry to create a bigger player and a more important business to get the economies of scale and gain an advantage. That's a well-trodden route in private equity and also on AIM. It's not something that VCTs can support anymore, so our range of opportunities got a bit more limited. And it's also the case that now when we make an investment in the VCT, the company's either going to be break-even, marginally profitable, or loss-making, and so we have to look forwards. And we set time horizons. It's interesting, this phrase that came in is now a little bit notorious: patient capital, which the government loved, and the government loves the idea of patient capital. But the problem with patient capital is capital is not patient; it's impatient by definition. And so we've set very clear kind of boundaries around how long we're willing to be patient for. We try and invest with a 2-year window to a major commercial milestone or profitability or something which is really going to clearly trigger the value that we were looking for when we invested. And we don't regard ourselves as capable of supporting an investment through a 10-year long runway to get to any kind of commerciality. And that's not really the purpose of the AIM market, and it doesn't work very well with those kind of businesses. They're just too early. So we think we have a reasonably good idea about what does work on AIM. And when we see companies that are interesting, that are thinking about floating, we love to try to talk about them talk to them really early on. So we're very often talking to them 6 months before they might float, and we try and help shape an IPO. And in a way, it's a very interesting kind of investing to get involved in. We meet companies at really crucial stages of their development, and we support them through it. And therefore, we become really quite close to them. And we're also then, if they're successful, we're then very long-term holders. So we're going to be with them for a long time. Actually, I'm really proud of the role that, if you like, the VCT now plays on AIM. I think it's important, and other AIM VCTs too.
Presumably there were positions that you were equally optimistic about when you first bought in that didn't work out. Looking back, what have you learned from some of those?
I think one of the things we learned over the years, back in 2005, when actually I first got involved in running AIM VCTs, the AIM market was really ill-disciplined. It was the range of opportunities that came to market were mostly very low quality, just not well enough thought through. The chances of success almost invariably turned out to be too low. And so, we, along with, I think, the AIM community in general, just had to develop the criteria and the the metrics, if you like, for what was likely to work and what would work on the market and what wouldn't, and to develop a kind of finer sense of what different industries will support. But that maturing process is not just because everyone was silly in 2005. Well, that's not the case at all. People were trying to get good companies to come to market. It's also the fact that I think this kind of industrial revolution I talk about, digital technology, went into what you might see as being an implementation phase from about 2010 onwards. And that meant that the tools you need were widely available, they were low cost, they became low cost, and they were highly effective from about that time onwards. But that really wasn't the case in 2005, and adoption was still very low, and you could have had the most brilliant idea and got nowhere with it then. So it wasn't that the ideas were bad, it's more that the ability to implement wasn't quite there yet. And so the market became full of sort of slightly overly ambitious projects that were unlikely to succeed. And it was really very difficult to find winners back then. As I sort of said, from about 2013 onwards, it became just there was a rich period when it became a lot easier, and some brilliant companies came forwards. A company like GB Group, of course, that goes back all the way to 2000. And when you look at its development, back in 2002, it just about scraped its way through the dot-com bust, and it was a CRM business back then. I think in 2002 it made its first foray into identity verification, which became its future. But it was still really looking for the right business opportunity. That wasn't a given back then. So these things have all had different and interesting development, but it's not been a uniform ride by any means. And we've had plenty of mistakes to learn from.
So you talk about this industrial revolution. Where do you think we are now, and where are you seeing the opportunities going forward? Where are you hunting to find the next keywords or learning technologies or GB Group?
Yeah, good question. And I should attribute some of the language I'm using about this to the economist Carlota Perez, who has actually just made a film for Baillie Gifford. It's on their website about her ideas. And I've been looking at her ideas for, 5, 6, 7 years. And they've been talked about by VC kind of interested parties for quite a number of years. And she's a profound optimist, and in some ways that's why I like her so much. I think she could probably be accused of being just too focused on the optimism and maybe missing not enough detail on some of the problems that come with industrial revolutions. But what's good about her ideas is that they allow you to stand back and just think about the bigger picture and what's going on industrially, because we've had a very, very noisy political 10 years, and it'd be very easy just to focus on that, and then you're just not thinking about some of the things that really matter. And it's interesting to say that on a day like such a momentous day like today, when we're trying to find out who the next US president is. But actually, it's not presidents and prime ministers who shape industrial cycles. They happen despite the politics, or because not because of it. But the idea that I'm referring to really is that you have this maybe 70-year cycle from when a technology gets discovered, and in this case, we're talking about digital technology. Carlota Perez would point the date of this particular cycle beginning to around 1972, when you had the first desktop computer being invented. And then you have a long period when, everyone underestimates it, nobody really knows what to do with it. People start adopting it, there's a lot of skepticism. And that climaxes with a period of frenzy and over-enthusiasm, which we saw in the dot-com boom. And then you have a crash, or maybe two crashes, as we had the dot-com bust and the great financial crisis. And then you have what she calls the implementation period. And that is important because she, I think, rightly identifies that period as being the golden age. It's when investors very broadly can, do very well by backing companies getting involved in implementing this technology. And that's what I think we've seen for the last 10 years. Interestingly, if you watch the Baillie Gifford film, Carlota Perez, I think, actually makes a mistake on that film by saying that the implementation period hasn't begun. And I disagree with that. I think it began in 2010, and it's actually matured really significantly in the last 10 years. And it's important to understand that, because if you didn't think that, you'd think it was fine just to do startups in every kind of digital area, and you're really too late. to do that. It's now no longer possible to start another Facebook or another Google, or most of the obvious targets have been cited and they've been hit. So the questions now are, well, what happens over the next 20-year period, and as this plays out? And I think there's a long way to go for digital technology to roll through all parts of the economy. And the one that we're really interested in now is healthcare. And I think what will happen with COVID-19 will act as a massive accelerator in the healthcare sector. And typically, us human beings like to spend at least a decade solving the last great crisis. And so we will spend the next 10 years solving the COVID crisis, in all probability, and we'll solve it many times over. That will act as just a catalyst and accelerator to what was already happening in healthcare. And the reason why I think healthcare is important is because there are some incredible technologies in healthcare that we spent the last 20 years watching develop. And in particular, I'm talking about cell therapy, the whole area of gene editing, cell therapy, the opportunity to treat somebody by taking some cells, editing the genes in those cells, reimplanting them, or even editing the cells in the body. But there are already approved products. Kymriah from Novartis being maybe the best case in point, where the treatment involves doing exactly that. You take some cells out of the body, you change the genes, you put them back in, and by doing that, you completely cure somebody from leukemia. And a very specific form of leukemia for maybe specific kinds of patients. It's an incredibly expensive treatment, but if you give it to a child, it's a one-off treatment and it's a complete cure. This kind of thing was dreamt of 20 years ago. It's now come to pass, and it's opening up, a very, very significant pipeline of other opportunities to do similar things in other areas. And I think this is now going to set the tone of innovation in healthcare for the next 10, 20 years. And so, we're very interested in investing in some of the real picks and shovels businesses, some of the key service providers to that industry, and some of the drug developers too. But I suppose when you're investing in smaller companies, it's maybe better to think of the services and the technologies provision that's going to be required, rather than just sort of the shots on goal with individual products, which is really quite a big company game still, where you're talking about investing hundreds of millions of dollars in single drugs, and they're at risk, and they may or may not work. If you're Novartis, you can do that. If you're a little AIM company, that's a lot harder, and so it's harder to support. Actually, Nasdaq's become very comfortable with those kind of investments, much more so than we are in the UK. I think it might be a while before the UK really matches that. It's interesting. The flow of information and investment between Nasdaq and the UK is increasing, and we're starting to see some of our investee companies from both the VC and the small cap funds who made their initial steps by using AIM funding, now then go to Nasdaq. So these are companies like Renalytix, Maxite, which we have in both the VC and the small cap fund, Amrit Pharmaceuticals, also in both of our funds. They're ploughing this pathway where they develop their products on AIM, but then they go to Nasdaq, where there's a lower cost of capital, a bigger audience. And it's good, because what that means is they're being ambitious for scaling up. And you probably need the kind of Nasdaq type support to compete properly on the US stage.
But it's a very different expertise to be able to analyse biotech stocks than it is, say, tech stocks. How do you have the skill to do that?
Well, it's one of the reasons why at Amati we divide up our work by sector, so it allows each of us to develop some sector expertise. And you're right, there are very different dynamics to each industry. It's particularly the case with healthcare. I think there's no other sector where such a lot of specialist knowledge is required, and the science is pretty baffling unless you've grown up in it and worked in it. And so, recognizing that, we last year actually, because we thought, already for the last couple of years, we were thinking, well, healthcare is just going to be a really big theme in our portfolios in a few years' time. So we should bring in some more expertise, and we're very lucky to be able to take on board a new analyst, Gareth Blades, who's joined us with a PhD in biosciences, and we really wanted to bring a scientist into the team so that we had somebody for whom that kind of science was their first language, rather than me, where I've looked at it for a long time, but I'm not a scientist. So I know the lingo, but I kind of speak by analogy in healthcare rather than as a first language. So it's great to have Gareth as part of our team to help us have more confidence in making some of the decisions that we have to make.
So going forward, should we expect that new positions are all going to be in healthcare?
No, it's not going to be. It's not going to be everything. But a significant proportion of the portfolios are going to be in healthcare. I think it's already the case. I think the VST is nearly 30% healthcare now, and that's reflecting some of the big gains in the stocks that are healthcare stocks. And actually, what's really pleasing about that is those are newer investments. So we know about the 2013, 14, 15 investments doing very well and driving a lot of value and frontier developments and keywords, as you talked about. Video games, everyone can understand that. But we are now starting to see some real successes from the newer investments made under the new VST rules in companies like Polarean Imaging, an amazing company that has this, really the first innovation in lung imaging technology for about 40 years. And it's got an interesting pedigree, the technology came out of GE, and it was something that kind of just got thrown away by GE in a management buyout many, many years ago. And it's been through various iterations, came to AIM a number of years ago. I was very interested in it when it came. I think we supported it in its second, third, and fourth fundraisings from the VST. And it's now within 6 months, hopefully, of getting an FDA approval. And that's really a major commercial landmark. But interestingly, they've already had 23 of their instruments acquired by major US research institutions. So the equipment is already being used for lots of new research, including research on COVID-19, because as you can imagine, COVID-19 does a lot of damage to lungs in certain cases where people have severe symptoms, and using Polarian's imaging, which also has the benefit of being non-radioactive. So the competition, if you like, the 40-year-old technology is called scintigraphy, and it involves you breathe in this radioactive isotope of xenon gas, and that allows an MRI scanner to see enough of your lungs to give you a kind of black and white 2D image. With Polarian's technology, they take the non-radioactive isotope of xenon 129, and they polarize it, which means you line up all of the magnetic field of each atom in identical alignment. So you hyperpolarize the gas, and that hyperpolarization allows the MRI scanner to give you a 3D image of the lungs and to show you exactly which bits are working and whether the epithelial layer is working, so not just whether the lung works, but whether the gas is transferring, the oxygen is transferring into the blood. So that, there's two types of things that can be wrong, at least, and two very basic types of things that can be wrong. And it can tell you which one is not working. And you just simply can't, you haven't been able to see that before. I think it's clearly an important piece of technology. So I can't tell you when it's going to and how fast it's going to commercialize, but we've been working pretty closely with them and they've made some really good developments. There's been some fantastic new members of the board join, and we're optimistic about it. Clearly, it's early days; it's got a long way to go, but and that's starting to get some recognition in the market. And when we were investing in the VST, I think at various points the company's market cap was in the 20s of millions and 30s. And to be able to buy a globally significant technology at that kind of price was fantastic. So when we see opportunities like that, we clearly want to make the most of them. But that's now, it's the second largest. On some days, it's the largest investment in the VST because it's appreciated quite a bit.
And you mentioned COVID. What did you do, say, in February when COVID was approaching this part of the world? How did you assess your portfolio? Did you sell anything? Did you buy anything? What was your reaction?
Well, the VST, doesn't respond to short-term things. It's a long-term investor typically. So our response is more in the small companies fund, where that's a much more diversified portfolio. It's more mature businesses. We try to manage it as it should be a lower risk portfolio. One of the ironies of 2020, which I think will be long remembered, is that the more you try to lay off risk in 2020, the worse you probably did. So, if you bought things which were traditionally low risk, mature companies, they've just done terribly this year. And even if, like us, you're diversified into those kind of companies to get a good spread of, so we want some, leading edge innovation in the small cap fund, but we also want some stability and some maturity. The way to do really well in 2020 was to be right on the front foot of this industrial revolution. Healthcare, online retailing, video games, certain sectors which have really flourished, whereas so much of the economy has really suffered. And many companies which one would have thought were just rock solid, mature companies suddenly going into free fall in their businesses. And then we're all now wondering, well, when do these come back and how strong are they when they do come back? So we decided early on in the pandemic to make some adjustments. Back in February, we ended up selling with regret, because we all the companies we owned we really liked. We sold out of Hollywood Bowl, I suppose, because we felt ten-pin bowling was never really going to be high up anyone's priority to get back up and running. And actually, we sold that on the basis that before we knew the pandemic was going to hit, because we thought, well, if it does hit, we can't really defend this holding. A little bit later, we sold even more reluctantly Gym Group, because actually, it was a bit more complicated. When Gym Group, we felt got overly sold in March, and we sold a bit, we bought a bit back very cheaply, and then it raised some money. And at that point, we started reading research from China to suggest that gyms were quite suspected as being a site of spreading the virus. And that led us to then think, well, okay, this is not going to be our top priority to hold it. I mean, this is not really to speak against Gym Group at all. It's a very strong business. And it does come into a category of interesting company that when the pandemic does eventually get put behind us in whatever form that takes, Gym Group, I think, will emerge as a stronger player than it was before, because so many smaller gyms will have sadly shut down. And then, so we actually look out for kind of companies where, when they do re-emerge, they'll re-emerge stronger than they were before. That should be something that investors look for in weighing up, or do I hold this company through its pain period, through the pandemic? And that's the kind of thinking we were doing. We were looking at questions like whether demand was destroyed or just delayed. And if you've got demand delay, then whenever the market opens up a little bit, you get a big rush of buying because there's pent-up demand. And we have seen that, interestingly, with house builders. We've seen it with furniture retailers. When you're locked in back in April, May, sitting on a really uncomfortable sofa you've been meaning to replace for a while, the minute you get the chance to do it, you're going to go out and do it. And that did kind of come to pass. There are other cases in point. So there was one company we bought into during the crisis, which was a shutdown business, which was then called Dark Group, now Jet2. And that interests us because we think that business, heaven knows when it's going to be able to start its business again uninterrupted. But when it does, it's going to be even stronger than it was before. And it was very strong before. It should emerge into a world where there's less supply, that competition is a lot weaker. There's now talk of stopping all holiday operators from using money from customers to finance their business, which Jet2 or Dark Group never did, and On the Beach haven't done, but other operators have done, unbeknown probably to their customers who thought their money was safeguarded for their holiday. If that gets stopped by the regulator, which it might do, then actually that's going to inhibit the competition even more. And it just shows there was already a big gap between what Dart were doing, what others were doing, or Jet2 were doing. And I think that gets larger later on. So it's not a big position for us, but it's one that we're sticking our neck out a bit in running through the pain period. But in general, we wanted the portfolio to point more towards the companies that were flourishing through this period. And so that meant healthcare companies, which we're adding to, video games businesses, which we were buying in March, April, May, June. We bought almost every month more in the video games markets. It's a very strong industry anyway in the UK. We've got some fantastic companies that are quoted, Frontier Developments, keywords you mentioned, but also there's Sumo, there's Codemasters, there's Team 17, which we don't own, but we own quite a number of those names. 4 of them in total between the funds. So, it's a sector that, again, it was already doing very well, but this has accelerated its reach into its markets. And then there's the question of when things unlock, what happens to those companies? And yes, they might see the foot coming off the gas a bit in terms of their growth. But I think with those businesses, the way that they work now, where they have this online distribution, they're in quite direct contact with their customer base once the game's being played. And you don't lose that once you've widened your audience, you keep that contact. And I think that does generate future value. The way these games work is every year they issue more content, and so the bigger their audience, the more their market reach becomes. So I think some of this value accretion we've been seeing gets maintained in the post-COVID world.
And which healthcare stocks were you buying into?
Well, we added to some ones we already had primarily. And I think the main new name we added actually was Renalytix. And Renalytix is very interesting, and stupidly, that's one that we didn't buy in the VC and should have done, and it's one we missed. Entirely my fault. But it's a business I even liked it back then. It was just about the price. And I think probably most of my worst mistakes in the VC in investments are companies we didn't buy because I thought they were too expensive. And there are other ones as well. So that's probably made more difference than the companies we do buy, but they turn out not to go so well because you can only lose what you invested. But if you miss a really great business, you're missing out on a multiple of what you invested. So Renalytix is a company that obviously it's involved in kidney disease, and it's involved in the diagnosis of chronic kidney disease. And it happens that that's an area where there's a big unmet need. And the difference between diagnosis at what they call stage 2 of kidney disease and either stages 3 or 4, and 4 is the last stage, is massive. And kidney disease becomes untreatable if you don't diagnose it early enough, and it becomes incredibly expensive to treat. Patients end up in dialysis, which is not a nice place to be and very expensive. But if you treat it in stage 2, it's treatable. But so the problem is identifying the right set of people to treat. And so you need to not just identify those with stage 2 kidney disease, but those who have stage 2 kidney disease, which ones are likely to progress to stage 3 and 4. And that's where Renalytix comes in. And they it was really a business that was put together in some ways by another AIM-quoted company called Eqtec. And that's a very interesting company as well. And it's a diagnostics business. In fact, the chief executive of that was chief executive of a business that we owned in one of our funds way back when in the early 2000s called BBI, which was a very successful diagnostics business. So they've kind of known what they're doing in diagnostics for a very long time. And they established this relationship with Mount Sinai Hospital, the major research and teaching hospital in New York, massive, great hospital. And they have a big department. It's a big center in kidney treatment. And so they also then had this big database of kidney disease, of past treatments, where they also had a blood bank, which had blood samples from all the stages of kidney disease amongst their former patients. And so EKF put together a business where they gave them 2 of their biomarkers for kidney disease. And these biomarkers are identified. Take a blood test. If you have these biomarkers, they identify you for kidney disease. And they wanted to combine that with the data set from Mount Sinai. And they then got James McCulloch, who has previously run an artificial intelligence company in healthcare that had been very successful and been sold. So he had the background in AI. And I suppose the other big theme in medicine, which I didn't mention earlier, is applying artificial intelligence to data. I think is a huge, yet to come, only partly realised area of the industrial revolution from digital technology. Clearly you can't do that without digital technology. Now you can do it. We have more and more sophisticated mathematical tools for doing it, statistical tools. And so this company was born, and it was created, and then I suppose the reason why I couldn't quite believe it at first was because 6 months after this agreement had been reached with DKF and Mount Sinai, they wanted to value the company at £45 million, and I've very rarely seen companies in 6 months create that much value. And in this case, they really had, and I was just wrong about balking at that. So, Renalytix has made incredible strides, and it's all about commercialization, really, and they developed the test, but how to get a test FDA approved when the FDA haven't known how to approve products based on artificial intelligence. How do you approve a product where the artificial intelligence doesn't sit still? So, if you like, you never have the finished product because the more data you give it, the more the artificial intelligence adapts to its data all the time. And it can give a different answer if you give it a load of new data. So how do you prove that as a product? And so, if you like, Renalytix had to solve that problem with the regulator. And they're one of a handful of companies that were dealing with that as a regulatory issue. And, again, it's this diagnostic kit has now achieved some remarkable milestones. It's been approved in New York. It's got clear lab approval, so they can actually sell it. They're waiting on FDA approval, but should get that not too far into next year. And equally importantly, they've already made big steps towards getting reimbursement. And it's no good just getting approval in the US. And it's very easy as a UK investor to forget this. They think it's all about approving a product. It's not. You actually got to sell it afterwards. And in order to sell it, you need a reimbursement code. So they have a reimbursement code, but then you also need availability, and you need to be listed by healthcare providers. So there's endless things to crack, and we think Renalytix have cracked enough of these that we were pretty happy to put this into our small cap fund. And we did it during lockdown because we were looking for companies where they were really on the front foot, if you like, in terms of what's happening. This is not going to be inhibited by COVID-19 to any big degree, maybe to a small degree, but it's compelling enough, and the regulator is still working. Progress can still be made, and they are still making a lot of progress. So that's one example. Another example where we had a holding already, but we added quite a bit, is a company called Maxite, which was in the VCT, was actually already a small holding in the small cap fund. And they raised money, can't remember exactly the month now, but I think it was during the pandemic. May have been just before, actually, so forgive me if I got my months a bit confused here. And they raised money because they wanted to get some what they call crossover investors on board. So these are investors who will take them to NASDAQ. So it's one where they wanted to go to NASDAQ. I didn't really like the placing that much in some ways because I thought that wasn't a brilliant reason to issue shares very cheaply. But then I thought, well, if they're going to issue shares very cheaply, then we should buy some. So we did. And Maxite, effectively, it plays into this gene editing cell therapy space. We already have an investment in a small cap fund called Oxford Biomedica, who do a kind of gene editing, which is a permanent form of gene editing using a virus, an attenuated virus, to carry DNA payload into cells. And viruses are very good at getting into cells. You just use that property to carry a genetic payload that you want to get into a DNA rather than one you don't want. And that's called the lentivirus, which is one that Biomedica uses. Maxite uses a completely different method of gene editing for cells, which uses an electrical charge where you kind of shock the cell very momentarily and it opens up its nucleus and you can get some DNA in there very quickly. And it's a very long established technique in labs. And they developed it's called electroporation, a lab technique, and they developed a more fluent version of this called flow electroporation. It's more scalable, it's faster, and they have the only kind of clinical grade way of using flow electroporation for gene editing of cells. And it's very widely licensed. They can charge a lot of money for it because it's having a huge amount of value, there isn't really another provider. And, we could just see a lot of growth to come. They've already got a big portfolio of potential milestone payments coming their way if their current set of licensees deliver on products. But we think that's going to grow significantly from here. And it's not just a sort of few years. This is a 10, 20-year long program of opportunity. So, again, taking that longer term view, it appeals to us as investors. Our dream investments are ones that we can buy and not have to worry about for a very long time. It's hard to find them, but that's how we're trying to construct the portfolio where we can.
Superb. Now, I've got many more questions, but so have our listeners. So I think that we better move over to listener questions. And we've got one question saying, I saw you bought Eqtec at the recent fundraise. Not sure if I've pronounced that right. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's called, as we did pretty well, Eqtec is how we pronounce it. Yes, one of the areas we've been looking at, maybe not surprisingly, is the whole business of energy transition. So, we're acutely aware as investors that, there's this 30-year requirement to change the way we live our lives from, deriving energy from fossil fuels to deriving energy in other ways. And so we've been very actively looking at the whole kind of what we call energy transition area. And it's wide-ranging. It covers a lot of different technologies and spaces. And we're hungry for those investments where we can find them. And I was introduced to Eqtec probably a few months before we invested in it. It's a company involved in gasification, and anyone who knows anything about gasification knows that it's a litany of disaster over many years. And the idea of gasification is that if you can take some fuel sources or maybe waste sources, maybe biomass, stuff that you're going to throw away, but not fossil fuels, but some renewably derived fuel sources. And you can, instead of incinerating them, which is what we currently do in very large scale in the UK, we have loads of incinerators up and down the country. If instead you can gasify them, which means that when you're putting them into a cylinder which is much hotter, so they don't have time to burn, they just immediately turn into gas. Then the idea is that's theoretically, it's a much more efficient process. But it's also one where there have been many, many people who've come along and said they can do it, and they haven't been able to do it. And so there are a lot of investors who got badly burnt with gasifiers, including there was a big company that built, I think, $1 billion plant in the northeast that had gasifiers, didn't work, wrote off a huge amount of money. So, gasifying is an area where massive potential, but lots of problems. And Eqtec has been working in this area for 20 years. And it was a very imperfectly formed company when it was on AIM. And it was really there as a sort of, wanted to be a project financing business using somebody else's technology. So it wasn't originally the Eqtec technology. Eqtec was actually a Spanish kind of company, which was a technology business that had gasification expertise. And the AIM-quoted business was going to maybe buy some technology from them or from other people and project finance developments. And then they kind of realized, well, they needed really to acquire this technology, and they did they reversed it back into the AIM company. So it became an IP owner. And for us, that's really important. We want businesses where they own their own IP. And, we think Eqtec has got some really world-leading expertise in gasification. They have actually built 4 or 5 plants over the last 10 years that work. They're the only gasification company we know where you can point to this plant in Spain they have, which has operated for 5 years, at 7,000 hours a year of availability, which is the kind of threshold you need for commerciality. And so actually when other people wanting to buy gasification plants want to do their DD, they can go and look at this plant, they can see 5 years of statistics. So we thought, well, actually, Eqtec's got something pretty special. It's not yet the fully formed thing. There is still more proof of concept to go. But, we thought, well, actually, this just looks like it should be backed by the market. And Clearly the rewards, if we back it early, are going to be very high. We don't need a big position in it. We couldn't have a big position even if we wanted it because it was a very tiny company and it's quite a big fund, the small cap fund. But it just felt like this was an interesting company to get involved with, and their project pipeline is now multiplying at quite a good rate. It's an interesting business, and I think the market will be watching for its real proof of concept developments, which will then deploy this technology from Spain to some bigger scale newer projects. And so they've got a lot to prove still, but it's a very interesting business in an area that we're fundamentally interested to be supporting.
Thank you. And there's a question here that asks, has the hydrogen industry attracted your interest yet?
It has, and clearly I wish we'd made investments in ITM and Ceres, and we didn't do. I think the difficulties for the hydrogen business are that there isn't really commercial infrastructure for hydrogen yet, and to get it there is going to need quite a bit of government vision and support. And there also aren't very many green sources of hydrogen, so a lot of the hydrogen that's available is coming from fossil fuels anyway, and so one has to be quite careful about hydrogen doesn't just solve all your problems per se, but for some time I was getting persuaded that the way forwards for vehicles would be hydrogen, not electric, because of the problems with batteries. I think actually Tesla have probably proven that wrong now. I don't think we're going to see passenger vehicles being powered by hydrogen. It's partly a factor of energy density, but when you compress hydrogen, you just don't get you get much lower energy density than you do from petrol or diesel. So it's kind of difficult to see you get enough range out of a car, plus you don't have the commercial infrastructure, so it's all a bit chicken and egg. And actually one has to be very careful when looking at new energy solutions that you are imagining that something can gain commercial scale when an incumbent technology has already got that commercial scale. And it's very clear now that Tesla has given the lithium-ion battery, for better or worse, commercial scale, and the costs have come down massively. They're solving some of the issues over things like cobalt. Cobalt was a big problem because you had to get it from conflict zones, and there were big ethical problems with that. Tesla have announced cobalt-free batteries will be their way forwards. Very intelligent and smart of them to do that. They have such scale already in that business. It's going to be difficult for rival technologies, even in battery areas, to come up against them because they have the scale advantage now, and that becomes incredibly important. Quite a few of the technologies I've seen over the years which have failed are just where they get stuck in this catch-22 where the product can't be sold because it's too expensive. It's a brilliant technology. You can't sell it because it costs too much. But if you could sell 100,000 of them, they wouldn't cost too much. But how do you cross that Rubicon? Who gives you the 100,000 order, which might be hundreds of millions of pounds? You can't get it. So you just get. There's a company called Ceramic Fuel Cells, which had this wonderful, thing you could put at home between your boiler and your hot water supply. It would use gas to generate electricity and use residual heat and all of that for your hot water. But they could never make them economic because they needed an order for too many, and they were too expensive as they were. And so, a lot of hydrogen technologies suffer the same thing. It'll be interesting to see what happens with ITM. They've got such backing. My worry over ITM is that their gross margins are very low, and that puts me off it quite a bit. If you're going to bring a new technology to market over 20 years and spend huge amounts of money on it, you at least want a decent gross margin to thank you for it. Very different with Ceres Power, where I think it's, we don't own it, so I'm not talking my own book at all, but, I'm kind of more interested in that because of high gross margins, more scalability.
And could you comment very briefly on the polarization in valuation between some of the older value style stocks and the growth stocks that seem extreme despite a 30% market correction this year?
Yeah. Well, the 30% market correction hasn't been in those stocks. It's been the opposite. So you've had a 60% market correction with the value stuff, maybe a 50% upward correction for the growth stocks. So this is already well talked about, but there has never been a more extreme divergence between what one might call growth and what one might call value. That should they give everyone pause to consider, well, do I just go and buy more Google and Amazon and, whatever the equivalents are on AIM? And I wish I knew the right answer to that. The severity of the dilemma is that, some of the areas which are now value stocks are also, they're not just threatened by COVID-19, they're threatened by much bigger industrial forces which might wipe them out. And so there's a huge danger of value traps. And so if you're going to go for the cheap stuff, you've got to be really careful, and you've got to be also forward-looking. Equally, on the growth side of the equation, it's still very attractive to buy into these amazing stories and growth themes, which are fundamentally just very attractive. And, you can see why everyone wants to invest in them. But the thing we need to be aware of is, typically when you get this kind of extreme divergence, you do get some kind of mean reversion, and you have to be willing to deal with that. So, it's the same. If you ever buy anything on the stock market, you have to do it knowing that you might lose quite a bit of money before you're going to make any. And that's, that is very, very obviously the case now. So we have to kind of curb our enthusiasm a little bit and say, well, let's be realistic. And when you invest, make sure that you're not investing money you can't afford to lose. You might have to be patient with some of these things. I would still want to be in companies where, I'm investing in things which have the potential to grow strongly over the next decade, regardless of COVID-19 or, where the industrial forces, if you like, are in their favour, where they've got a tailwind. And actually the UK, I think, is pretty good for that, because, in the UK, you might pay 30 times for a growth stock. In the US, you're going to pay 65 times for the same kind of quality of growth. So it's a little bit less extreme here.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. But where can people find out more about Amati and more about you?
Well, I like to think we have a very helpful website, lots of information, performance graphs, information on funds, our sales team are always very happy to speak to people if there's any questions or inquiries. We have a info@amatiglobal.com email address for any email questions too.
Tremendous, thank you. If you want an email notification of investor events that PI World are organising, sign up in the box on the right-hand side of the homepage at PI World. There are two boxes, the top a notification of a new video as it's published, and underneath for events, and they're different lists and there's no spam. A video and a podcast of this interview will be available tomorrow on PI World. Please share it. We'd love them to reach an even wider audience, so please spread the word. And if you have ideas of interview guests, please email through the contact page at piworld.co.uk or message me on Twitter at @TamsinPIWorld. Many thanks to Paul, and many thanks to you all for joining us. Stay well.